The forest had always whispered, even before the Blackwell family arrived. Trees loomed like silent sentinels, and the wind carried a hollow warning no passerby could decipher. When the sisters first set foot in the creaking cabin their father had claimed as home, the air seemed to thicken, pressing against them like an unseen hand. It was not the chill of the woods that unsettled them, but a strange, oppressive quiet that swallowed every laugh, every spark of innocence. Even the birds seemed wary, keeping distance as if the trees themselves knew the secrets the Blackwells carried. At night, the sisters huddled together, listening to faint shuffles from rooms they were told never to enter, hearing hushed voices speaking words they weren't meant to understand. Curiosity gnawed at them, a dark temptation they could not resist. One evening, a loose floorboard revealed a hidden bundle of letters, ink smudged and brittle with age, spilling fragments of confessions, rules, and a twisted hierarchy of fear that held the family captive. With every secret unearthed, the forest seemed to close in tighter, its shadows stretching longer, pressing them toward truths that no light could fully illuminate. The sense of being watched never left them, and every creak, every whisper from the walls felt like a warning that some horrors, once awakened, refused to remain buried. The Blackwell sisters had stepped into the heart of a story that the world outside the trees would never believe, a cold tale of control, silence, and darkness that had thrived, hidden, in plain sight. The Blackwell family's arrival in the remote stretch of forest was the kind of event that drew curiosity only in whispers and distant glances. The cabin they had chosen was old, wooden, and leaning slightly as if it had been waiting for them, anticipating their presence. Its windows were narrow and grimy, catching the occasional ray of sunlight but reflecting back a shadowy image that seemed almost alive. The road leading to it was little more than a dirt track, winding through thick groves of towering pines that blocked out most of the sky. Even the birds seemed cautious, hesitant to enter the canopy around the property, and the wind carried with it the muted groans of the forest, blending with the rustle of leaves to create a soundscape that felt both alive and watchful. No neighbors were in sight, and the distant townsfolk spoke of the area with hushed reverence, warning outsiders that the woods had always held secrets. The family's car rattled along the narrow path, dust curling into the air, and when it finally came to a stop at the cabin, the stillness that followed felt almost unnatural, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. The father emerged first, tall and imposing, his expression unreadable and his eyes sweeping the tree line as though expecting something to respond. Behind him, the sisters trailed silently, clutching their small bundles of belongings, their young faces pale and tense. The cabin door creaked open, and the scent of damp wood and decaying leaves spilled outward, mingling with the cold air that seemed heavier than the sunlit sky suggested. Inside, the walls were bare, rough, and lined with shadows that stretched and twisted along the corners, reacting to their tentative footsteps. Every floorboard groaned under their weight, as though protesting their presence, and the fireplace sat unused, a hollow reminder that warmth would not come easily to a place that had been left to the mercy of time and neglect. Outside, the forest pressed close, the thick underbrush hiding what might lie beyond, every tree trunk and shadow an unanswered question. Even as the sisters unpacked, the sense of being observed persisted, a subtle pressure that made them glance over their shoulders more than once, their whispers swallowed by the vast emptiness. The father remained still, his eyes occasionally flicking to the distant tree line, scanning for something unseen, and in that gaze, there was both authority and an unspoken warning that no one else could approach. For the sisters, the woods were no longer just trees and soil, they were a living, breathing entity that mirrored the strange, oppressive tension their family brought with them, a forest poised to hide secrets, enforce silence, and watch the unfolding of a story that had been waiting for their arrival. The sisters' childhood unfolded under a thick veil of silence that pressed down harder than the dense canopy of the surrounding forest. From the moment they could speak, they learned that some words carried consequences far heavier than the fear of punishment. There were things in their home that could never be named, and questions that could never be asked. Their days were structured by a rigid rhythm dictated by their father's invisible rules, a pattern so strict and unyielding that even the smallest deviation drew a quiet, menacing disapproval that lingered longer than any shouted threat could. The house itself seemed complicit in maintaining the secrecy, each narrow corridor and shadowed corner functioning as a silent witness to events that no outsider could ever comprehend. Family meals were quiet affairs, punctuated by glances that communicated more than conversation ever could, and the sisters quickly learned to read these unspoken cues, understanding which behaviors would draw a frown, a sharp glance, or a chilling silence that filled the room with tension. Toys and books were sparse, chosen carefully to avoid triggering memories or questions, and even the walls seemed to absorb their youthful voices, echoing back only in distorted, unsettling ways. There were nights when the sisters huddled together, listening to the faint creaks and murmurs of rooms they were forbidden to enter, and though the house felt empty to an outsider, to them it thrummed with a hidden life, alive with whispers that hinted at unspeakable truths. Their father's presence was constant yet intangible, an ever-watchful force whose gaze seemed to follow even when he was absent, and every rule enforced a lesson: trust the world outside the family lightly, and never, ever speak of what happened within these walls. Even their mother, though present, was a figure shrouded in passive complicity, offering warnings in low tones that did not comfort but reinforced the understanding that their childhood was not theirs to claim freely. Friends were discouraged, contact with the outside world limited, and any attempt to reach beyond the forest's boundary was met with subtle intimidation that left the sisters questioning their own perceptions. In the quietest moments, they would glance at each other, seeking a reflection of the unease they both felt, realizing that even in their shared experiences, each secret carried its own weight and shadow. Over time, the sisters' understanding of normal childhood vanished, replaced by a constant vigilance, a learned instinct to navigate a labyrinth of forbidden knowledge and hidden threats, and though they could never name what had been done to them, the forest seemed to echo their fear, pressing closer with every secret they were forced to carry, shaping not only who they were but how they would learn to survive in a world that demanded silence and obedience. It began with a simple curiosity, one that felt almost innocent in the quiet monotony of the cabin, yet it carried with it the weight of a world the sisters were not meant to see. While exploring the corners of the house that had long been forbidden, one sister's fingers traced the edges of a loose floorboard, catching on something tucked beneath it. The object was small and fragile, wrapped in yellowed paper that crumbled at her touch, yet even in its decay, it exuded an unmistakable sense of importance, as if it had been waiting for decades for the right eyes to find it. She lifted the bundle carefully, feeling the thrill of discovery mixed with a deep, instinctive dread that whatever lay within could not be good. Inside were letters, brittle and faded, their handwriting uneven but deliberate, filled with words that spoke of rules, warnings, and the boundaries that the family had established in secret. The letters were addressed to no one but seemed meant for someone who had been forced to understand without explanation, and their tone carried an authority that chilled even as it demanded attention. Alongside them were journals, pages filled with fragmented confessions and cryptic notations, hinting at rituals and behaviors that twisted normalcy into something dark and unrecognizable. The sister's hands trembled as she read phrases that suggested control over those closest to her, manipulation that had become routine, and acts that violated the very idea of safety and trust within a family. Each sentence she deciphered deepened the horror, yet the pull to continue was irresistible, the curiosity too strong to resist despite the growing fear that the walls themselves might be listening. The cabin, once simply a shelter, felt suddenly alive with implication, shadows stretching across the corners as if the house itself bore witness to the secrets uncovered. When she showed the other sister, their eyes met with a mixture of disbelief and terror, the silent acknowledgement of what had been hidden for so long binding them together in a shared horror. The discovery was more than just papers, it was the first tangible proof that the fears they had sensed in childhood were real, that the oppressive control and unspoken rules had a foundation deeper and more sinister than they had ever imagined. Even the forest outside seemed to react, the wind carrying an edge of warning, the trees standing taller and darker against the fading light, as if aware that the family's secrets were being disturbed. In that moment, the sisters realized that curiosity had opened a door they could never close, and that the house, the forest, and the past itself were all conspiring to teach them that some knowledge comes with a cost, a chilling understanding that would shape every step they took from that night forward. The presence of their father was more than just authority. It was a weight that pressed into every corner of the cabin, a constant reminder that the walls were not neutral, that silence and obedience were the only safe options. He moved through the house with a deliberate slowness, each step measured, each glance precise, as though he were aware of every thought that flickered behind the sisters' eyes. The air seemed to shift when he entered a room, colder somehow, carrying the subtle scent of something unspoken, and the sisters instinctively drew inward, lowering their voices, adjusting their posture, small gestures of survival honed over years of implicit training. Conversations that took place in hushed tones often ended abruptly at the hint of his approach, as though even the shadows themselves sensed the danger in being discovered speaking too freely. There was a careful rhythm to his control, a pattern that the sisters began to anticipate without ever fully understanding, a series of invisible rules that extended to their smallest actions. Meals, chores, even casual movements around the cabin were scrutinized in ways that were almost imperceptible yet entirely oppressive, the kind of scrutiny that leaves no room for innocence. His presence in the forest surrounding the cabin was equally unnerving, as he would walk along the edge of the tree line, scanning the shadows as though anticipating intrusions or threats, a silent guardian of a domain that should have been safe yet felt more like a cage. He spoke little, but when he did, it was in tones that carried subtle menace, warnings embedded in the cadence of his voice rather than in any outright command. The sisters learned to interpret every sigh, every pause, every sharp glance, understanding quickly that his authority was absolute and that questioning it, even silently, was dangerous. Even the journals and letters they had discovered paled in comparison to the shadow he cast. The written secrets were static, confined to pages, but he was alive, moving through space and time in ways that enforced obedience beyond words. At night, when the cabin was silent and the forest breathed around them, the sense of being watched intensified, a quiet, inescapable vigilance that left the sisters tense and alert. Even in his absence, they felt his influence pressing down, shaping their thoughts and fears, teaching them the boundaries of what could be imagined, what could be spoken, and what must remain hidden. His control was invisible yet omnipresent, a cold, relentless force that taught them that survival depended not on rebellion but on acquiescence, and that the shadow of a single figure could dominate lives more completely than any locked door or hidden room ever could. As the days in the cabin stretched into months, the sense of isolation grew heavier, pressing into the sisters' lives with a quiet, relentless weight. The forest, once a backdrop to their strange upbringing, became a barrier, a living wall that separated them from any hope of the outside world. The trees formed thick, unyielding boundaries, their branches tangling together so densely that sunlight struggled to reach the forest floor, casting everything in a perpetual gloom that mirrored the suffocating control of their father. Attempts to leave, however small, were met with subtle resistance, small gestures of intimidation, doors left mysteriously locked, the soft creak of floorboards betraying unseen eyes. Even when they dared to speak to neighbors or wanderers passing on the dirt roads beyond the trees, their father's presence, or the mere threat of it, loomed over them, a silent reminder that the world outside was out of reach, and curiosity could be punished without explanation. The sisters' days became measured and predictable, dictated not by the sun or the seasons, but by an unspoken code that made the cabin itself a cage. Nights were the worst. The walls seemed to close in as shadows moved in unnatural ways, long shapes stretching across the corners of rooms and corridors, distorted by flickering candlelight or the moon that barely penetrated the canopy. The forest whispered constantly, a low, persistent sound carried on the wind, but its whispers were not comforting. They hinted at unseen watchers, the presence of their father beyond the visible, a force both literal and psychological that made the sisters hyper-aware of every movement, every sound. Outside voices were rare, muted, and quickly silenced by fear. The isolation ensured that no one could intervene, that no curious passerby could stumble upon what was happening behind the cabin walls. Even the discovery of the journals and letters did not alleviate the isolation. If anything, it made the sisters more aware of how utterly alone they were, trapped not only by geography but by an oppressive control that extended into their thoughts and fears. The cabin and the forest combined to form an ecosystem of surveillance and secrecy, one where the sisters' own instincts had to serve as both shield and guide, teaching them to navigate dangers that were both visible and invisible. The further they retreated into themselves, the more the boundaries of the forest mirrored the boundaries of their minds, and every tree, every shadow, every wind-blown branch became a reminder that isolation was not just a state of being, but a method of control that ensured that the horrors within the family remained hidden, contained, and inescapable. The stillness of the woods was suddenly broken by the presence of an outsider, someone who stumbled into the edge of the forest with curiosity in their eyes but no inkling of the darkness they were approaching. A traveler, a local who had taken a wrong turn, or perhaps a wandering hunter, noticed the cabin that the Blackwell family occupied, its crooked chimney, the weathered wood, the slight smoke rising in hesitant spirals as if the house itself were breathing with caution. At first glance, nothing seemed remarkable, yet there was a subtle unease, a sense that the trees were holding the newcomer at bay, whispering warnings that only those attuned to the forest could feel. The sisters noticed the stranger too, a figure moving carefully along the narrow path, and in that observation, an unfamiliar stir of curiosity mixed with fear took root. The stranger's gaze lingered on the cabin, on the faint shapes of the sisters behind the curtains, and even the father's calculated movements did not go unnoticed. Something about the way this outsider looked, too alert, too questioning, disturbed the careful equilibrium that the family had maintained for years. Their quiet world, meticulously controlled and hidden, was suddenly vulnerable to scrutiny. Small gestures became amplified, every glance, every cough, every shift in posture scrutinized as if the walls of the cabin themselves had eyes. The sisters, who had long learned to navigate the oppressive presence of their father, now faced the tension of someone seeing, perhaps understanding, more than they were supposed to. Whispers between the sisters became urgent and secretive, each word carefully measured so that it would not escape beyond their walls. The stranger, unaware of the invisible lines of danger, seemed drawn to anomalies, the way the children avoided certain rooms, the unnatural silence that hung over the cabin, the father's rigid demeanor. He asked casual questions to passing townsfolk, subtle inquiries that hinted at suspicion, and though his presence was fleeting, it sent ripples through the family's fragile sense of control. Shadows in the cabin lengthened as if in response, corners and hallways twisting in ways that heightened tension and unease, turning mundane spaces into arenas of potential exposure. Even the forest seemed to participate in the scrutiny, the wind carrying the rustle of leaves like whispers of warning to the sisters. The delicate balance of secrecy and compliance that had defined their lives began to tremble under the gaze of a single, inquisitive outsider, leaving the sisters to realize for the first time that even the densest woods, even the most isolated cabin, could not guarantee that the horrors they endured would remain hidden forever. For years, the sisters had existed in a world defined by whispers, shadowed corners, and rules that were never fully explained. Every day was a lesson in obedience, a careful negotiation with fear, and yet beneath the weight of this oppressive control, a quiet rebellion began to stir. It started with small acts, imperceptible to anyone who did not know what to look for, a lingering glance, a soft sigh, a pause that lasted just a second longer than expected. They had learned to communicate without words, to read each other's expressions as if decoding secret messages embedded in subtle gestures, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, these small exchanges began to carry the seeds of defiance. The sisters began to share fragments of what they had discovered in the hidden letters and journals, whispering in corners where shadows promised concealment, each revelation binding them together in a shared understanding of the horrors that surrounded them. The cabin, once a place of rigid authority and silent compliance, became a space where tension coexisted with clandestine connection, where each hidden exchange felt like a spark in the darkness. Even as the father's gaze remained ever watchful, the sisters found ways to carve out moments of autonomy, subtle pauses in the routine that allowed them to assert, however quietly, that they were not entirely powerless. They would linger near a door they were told never to approach, their fingers brushing against the handle just long enough to feel a thrill of danger, and then retreat before the shadow of discovery could fall. A shared glance at the unusual position of a floorboard, a book, or a pattern of letters became a secret language, a method of silently acknowledging the truths they could not speak aloud. Each small act of defiance was fraught with risk, yet it carried a power that neither the cabin nor the forest could suppress. The sisters began to imagine life beyond the rigid boundaries imposed by their father, to question the rules that had governed every breath they took. The tension in the house shifted subtly, rooms that had seemed impregnable to intrusion now hummed with a new energy, an undercurrent of awareness and subtle resistance that even the trees seemed to sense. Shadows no longer felt solely oppressive, they became allies, concealing whispered plans and careful movements. The cracks in the silence, once imperceptible, widened imperceptibly with each passing day, revealing that control, no matter how absolute it seemed, could be challenged in quiet, patient ways. The sisters were learning the dangerous power of shared understanding, discovering that the bonds they had formed in secrecy might be the first step toward unearthing a reality that had been buried under years of fear, manipulation, and unspoken horrors. The revelation came quietly, almost imperceptibly at first, like a shadow slipping across the floor, and yet its impact was immediate and overwhelming. The sisters, emboldened by their whispered conspiracies and secret exchanges, had begun to piece together the fragments of truth hidden within the letters and journals they had discovered. Each line, each smudged sentence, had hinted at a web of control and manipulation, but nothing could have prepared them for the full, unrelenting scope of what they uncovered. The truth was grotesque, a twisted tapestry of obedience enforced through fear and secrecy, and the sheer enormity of it threatened to shatter the fragile equilibrium they had maintained for so long. Names, dates, and events leaped from the pages like specters, each one a testament to acts of domination that had been carried out under the guise of family authority. The sisters could feel their stomachs tighten, their breaths caught between disbelief and horror, as the realization sank in that every rule, every hushed warning, had been designed to conceal unspeakable acts that violated the most fundamental bonds of trust. What had once been abstract, a sense of unease, a vague fear, became concrete, undeniable, and horrifyingly real. The cabin seemed to respond to their discovery, the walls closing in, the shadows stretching longer and darker, as if the house itself were mourning the exposure of secrets it had held for decades. Their father, the ever-present shadow whose authority had defined every moment of their lives, suddenly seemed even more omnipotent and terrifying in the clarity of understanding. The sisters could see how carefully he had manipulated every interaction, every gesture, every word, to ensure compliance, to maintain a reality where no one could question, no one could intervene. The forest surrounding the cabin, which had once seemed merely an obstacle or a protective barrier, now felt like a silent accomplice, hiding the horrors from the world outside while magnifying the sense of entrapment inside. Even as they read and reread the journals, the letters, and the scraps of evidence, they realized that knowledge alone did not confer safety. The revelation was both liberating and paralyzing, offering clarity while simultaneously emphasizing their vulnerability. They were now fully aware of the mechanisms of control, the extent of abuse, and the intricate layers of secrecy that had kept the family's darkest truths hidden. And yet, within that horrifying clarity, a sense of resolve began to form, fragile but persistent, hinting that understanding the depths of the horror might be the first step toward navigating a world that had long been defined by silence, fear, and hidden darkness. The climax unfolded in the woods like a storm long anticipated but never named, a convergence of fear, desperation, and the raw intensity of hidden truths finally colliding with the world around them. The forest, which had always been both a barrier and a silent witness, now seemed to tighten around the sisters, its shadows deepening, every rustle of leaves magnified into an ominous signal that danger was imminent. The father, sensing the subtle defiance that had begun to take shape in their eyes and gestures, moved with deliberate force, his presence cutting through the trees like a dark blade. Each step he took was measured, precise, yet imbued with a tension that suggested the full weight of his authority was about to descend. The sisters, hearts pounding in unison, felt the gravity of their situation sharpen to a terrifying clarity. The wind carried sounds that were previously unnoticed, the distant snap of a branch, the creak of the cabin's forgotten floorboards, the whisper of their own movements through underbrush, and each sound seemed amplified by the forest, echoing with the potential for discovery, confrontation, or catastrophe. It was in that crucible of tension that the truth, long buried and fragmented, became unbearable in its immediacy. The sisters confronted the twisted legacy of control and secrecy in ways that could not be undone, forced to navigate both the literal terrain of dense trees and the figurative terrain of trauma and fear. Their father's shadow loomed over every movement, a presence that had always been psychological now made tangible in the tightening circle of trees and the narrowing paths they had to follow. Even the forest seemed complicit, every branch and root a subtle obstacle, every rustling leaf a reminder of the ever-watchful gaze that had defined their lives. The sisters' whispers became urgent, their gestures more deliberate, as they sought to assert control, to claim some small measure of autonomy in the face of overwhelming force. The climax was not marked by violence alone but by the intensity of psychological revelation, the exposure of hidden hierarchies, and the confrontation with truths that had remained carefully concealed for years. In the dappled shadows of the forest, the lines between fear and courage blurred, obedience and defiance collided, and the sisters' understanding of their world shifted irreversibly. Every moment was stretched taut, every breath a negotiation with terror and anticipation, and the forest itself seemed to pulse with the rhythm of revelation, amplifying the stakes of confrontation. In that space between trees and shadows, the long-suppressed tension of years came to a head, revealing the intricate, disturbing dynamics that had governed their lives while making painfully clear that the consequences of exposure were immediate, unrelenting, and unavoidable. Even after the climactic confrontation in the dense woods, a sense of unresolved tension clung to the Blackwell sisters, a haunting reminder that some truths, no matter how fully uncovered, refused to be contained or neatly explained. The forest, once merely a backdrop for their isolation and fear, now carried an echo of everything that had transpired within its shadows, the wind weaving through the trees like a whisper of secrets that were both revealed and still hidden. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig beneath unseen feet, suggested the presence of forces beyond comprehension, or perhaps the enduring weight of the past pressing into the present. The sisters could not shake the feeling that eyes remained on them, that the cabin, the woods, and even the memories they carried were alive with observation and judgment. While the overt control of their father had been challenged, the mechanisms of secrecy and silence that had dominated their lives for so long continued to ripple outward, leaving them to navigate an environment where fear and uncertainty were inextricably intertwined. Attempts to explain what had happened to outsiders were met with disbelief or horror, reinforcing the sense that the full story could never truly be told, that parts of the truth were destined to remain hidden, like shadows in the corners of a room that no light can fully illuminate. The sisters' own memories seemed unreliable at times, fragments of experiences blending with imagination, leaving them questioning what was real, what was exaggerated, and what was deliberately concealed by the forest itself. Even in moments of relative calm, the cabin remained oppressive, the silence that once protected it now functioning as a subtle reminder of everything that had occurred and everything that might never be understood. The local townspeople, aware only of rumors or partial truths, added to the ambiguity, their whispered speculations creating a fog of uncertainty that mirrored the sisters' own fractured understanding of their history. The lingering mystery extended not only to the events themselves but to the psychological impact of living under such prolonged and pervasive control, leaving scars that would not fade with daylight or distance. The sisters moved through the forest and their home with heightened awareness, their instincts sharpened by years of navigating both visible and invisible threats, yet even these instincts could not fully shield them from the sense that the past and the secrets it contained were omnipresent, that the story of the Blackwell family was not confined to a single timeline or location. It hovered in the shadows, in the wind, in the spaces between rooms, a persistent, intangible force that ensured the horrors endured and would continue to echo, haunting every step and every thought long after the immediate dangers had passed.